Welcome to the channel, where survival stories come to life. In today's thrilling tale, we will dive into the heart of a post-apocalyptic world where humanity is on the brink of extinction. The zombie apocalypse has ravaged the earth, leaving only a handful of survivors fighting to hold on to what little hope remains. These survivors will have to battle not just the undead but their own fears, weaknesses, and the remnants of society that threaten to tear them apart. The stakes couldn't be higher, and every choice they make could mean life or death. If you're into gripping stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, filled with suspense and survival, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on more heart-pounding, edge-of-your-seat adventures. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for the first part of this epic story. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over what was once a thriving city. Now, it was a shell of its former self, with buildings crumbling and streets littered with debris. The world had changed, and for the few survivors still clinging to life, it was a daily struggle to stay alive in a world overrun by the undead. Amidst the devastation, a group of survivors had managed to form a tight-knit community. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to reclaim their lives, to save what little humanity was left in the world. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks to months, the tension within the group grew. Resources were running low, and with each passing day, the undead grew stronger, more aggressive, and more numerous. It was clear that the world was on the verge of total collapse. At the heart of this ragtag group was Sarah, a former military medic who had seen more than her fair share of violence and chaos. Her training had kept her alive, but it was her will to protect those she cared about that had made her a natural leader. Sarah knew that the group couldn't stay in the same location forever. They had to find a way to move forward, to find a safe haven, somewhere free from the constant threat of zombies. Listen up! Sarah's voice rang out, cutting through the murmur of conversation as the survivors gathered around. We've been here too long. We need to move out before it's too late. The undead are getting closer every day. If we stay here, we'll be trapped. Mark, a former police officer who had become one of Sarah's closest allies, stepped forward. His rugged face was grim, his brow furrowed as he looked around the group. And where exactly are we supposed to go? We've scavenged everything we can in this area. We don't even know if there's anywhere safe left. Sarah met his gaze. She knew Mark's concerns were valid. No one had been able to venture far without encountering hordes of zombies or worse, other hostile survivors. But she couldn't let fear control their decisions. We keep moving, Mark. We adapt or we die. We've survived this long by thinking on our feet. We can't stop now. There was a murmur of agreement from the others, though uncertainty still hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the risks of leaving the relative safety of their current hideout, but Sarah's resolve was unwavering. They had no choice. Staying in one place for too long was a death sentence. As night fell and the group made their preparations, the tension was palpable. Weapons were checked, supplies were packed, and each person steeled themselves for the journey ahead. Sarah lingered by the fire, her thoughts drifting to her younger brother, Ethan, who had been by her side throughout the apocalypse. He was her rock, and losing him wasn't an option. Ethan, you good to go? Sarah asked, turning to him as he adjusted his backpack. Ethan, who had grown into a capable young man despite the horrors he had witnessed, nodded. Yeah, just worried about the others. We're running low on food, and I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting smile, though her heart ached. We'll make it, we always do. Just keep your head down, stay with the group, and trust each other. That's all we can do now. The group set out under the cover of darkness, moving cautiously through the ruins of the city. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the undead in the distance. Sarah led the way, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. Mark took the rear, his weapon ready, eyes constantly darting to the rear. They moved quickly but quietly, avoiding main streets and sticking to alleyways where they might have a better chance of avoiding the roaming zombies. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in on them from all sides. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the air. Everyone froze. Sarah signaled for the group to stop, her eyes narrowing as she searched the surrounding area. Then, through the gloom, she saw them, shuffling figures, their grotesque forms barely visible in the moonlight. The zombies had found them. "Run!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with urgency as she turned and sprinted forward. The others followed suit, their hearts pounding in their chests as the undead began to close in. But the group was too slow, and the zombies were faster than they had hoped. The fight for survival had just begun. The sound of shuffling feet grew louder as the group sprinted through the darkened streets. The undead were relentless, their movements jerky but surprisingly swift as they closed in on the survivors. Sarah pushed forward, her heart racing as she focused on leading her group to safety. Behind her, she could hear the heavy breathing of her companions, the frantic scramble of their footsteps as they fought to stay ahead of the zombies. "Stay together!" Sarah yelled, her voice hoarse with panic. "Keep moving!" Mark was at the rear, his hand gripping his rifle tightly as he fired off a shot to clear a path. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty streets, sending a ripple of dread through the group. Every shot was a call for more zombies, and they couldn't afford to draw attention. "Keep it quiet!" Sarah snapped, glancing over her shoulder. "We don't have time for noise." But there was no time to argue. The horde was closing in, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air. They needed to reach the abandoned warehouse a few blocks away. It had been their backup plan, a potential sanctuary if things went south. But now, it was their only chance. "Over here!" Sarah called out, veering off the main road and into a narrow alleyway. The others followed without hesitation, knowing she was the one who always led them to safety. But as they pushed deeper into the alley, they were met with a horrifying sight. The alley was blocked. A large dumpster had been tipped over, creating a barricade that they couldn't get around. The undead were closing in from both sides now, and the group was trapped. "Move the dumpster!" Mark shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He pushed forward, trying to shift the heavy metal container, but it was too heavy. Sweat dripped from his face as he struggled, knowing time was running out. "Forget it!" Sarah snapped, turning to face the growing horde. "We fight! We're not going down without a fight!" The survivors quickly formed a defensive line, their backs pressed against the wall as they prepared for what was to come. Sarah's pulse raced, but she stayed calm. She knew what they had to do. Each person was armed with whatever they could scrounge up: knives, makeshift spears, and firearms. They had no choice but to stand their ground. "Get ready!" Sarah shouted, gripping her own weapon tightly. She could hear the groans of the zombies as they shuffled closer, their decayed bodies inching toward the group. They were fast now, more aggressive, and there were so many of them. The first zombie lunged at them, its putrid breath washing over Sarah as it reached for her. Without hesitation, she slammed the butt of her rifle into its skull, sending it crashing to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate the victory. Another zombie lunged, and then another, each one coming at them with terrifying speed and fury. Mark fired off a few shots, hitting one in the head and sending it to the ground. But the noise only attracted more of the undead. A dozen or more emerged from the shadows, their eyes dead and their hands reaching for the survivors. "Back up!" Sarah yelled, her voice sharp. "We need to move." The group began to retreat, stepping carefully over the fallen bodies of the undead as they made their way further down the alley. But it was no use. The zombies were relentless, and they were getting closer with every passing second. The survivors fought back with everything they had, but fatigue was starting to take its toll. Ethan, her younger brother, was at her side, his face pale with fear. "Sarah, what are we going to do? There's too many of them." Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to keep her focus. They couldn't afford to panic. "Not now. We keep fighting," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We keep moving. We're not dying here." Just as she finished speaking, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the alley. The survivors turned to see a massive group of zombies stumbling toward them, their ragged forms advancing with disturbing speed. It was clear they were outnumbered, and the danger of being overwhelmed was all too real. "This is bad," Mark muttered, his voice grim as he surveyed their situation. The alley was narrowing, and the horde was closing in from both ends. There was nowhere to go. "Listen to me," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the area. "There's a fire escape on the building to the left. If we can reach it, we can get to the roof. We'll have the high ground, and they won't be able to reach us up there." Mark nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "It's a long shot, but it's the only chance we've got." "Then let's take it," Sarah ordered. The group turned and bolted toward the fire escape, their legs burning with exhaustion as they ran. Behind them, the sound of the zombies' growls and the shuffling of their feet grew louder. But they pushed on, knowing their only hope for survival lay in reaching the roof. As they reached the fire escape, Sarah was the first to climb up, followed closely by Mark, then Ethan, and the rest of the group. The metal rungs felt slippery under their hands, but they didn't stop to think. Every second mattered. Finally, they reached the top, pulling themselves onto the roof just as the first wave of zombies reached the base of the building. The survivors quickly pulled the ladder up behind them, breathing a collective sigh of relief. But they knew this was only a temporary respite. The battle for survival was far from over. The zombies were still out there, and the struggle to find a safe place in a world overrun by the undead was just beginning. The night stretched on, and the survivors found themselves huddled on the roof, the dim glow of the city lights flickering in the distance. Their breathing was heavy, their hearts still racing from the close call in the alley. Though they had momentarily escaped the horde, the danger was far from over. The undead were still out there, and as they looked out over the ruined city, it was clear that their options were running thin. Sarah sat near the edge of the roof, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her mind was racing, calculating their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. The fire escape was already compromised, and it wouldn't take long before the zombies began to gather beneath them. They needed a plan. "Ethan," Sarah called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her younger brother, who had been pacing nervously, turned toward her. "Get over here." Ethan hesitated for a moment before walking over to where Sarah sat. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the responsibility she carried. She had always been the strong one, the leader, but now even she seemed unsure. "We need to find food and water," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "We can't survive on nothing. We have to move out again." Ethan nodded, though a look of uncertainty crossed his face. "I know, but where are we supposed to go? We've been everywhere, and every place we check is either abandoned or crawling with zombies." "I know," Sarah replied. "But we can't stay here. This place is too exposed. We need to keep moving." As Sarah and Ethan spoke in hushed tones, Mark approached, wiping sweat from his brow. His rifle hung loosely at his side, his face drawn with worry. "Sarah, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We can't keep running forever." "I know," Sarah said, standing up and brushing off her hands. "But we don't have a choice. There's a compound north of here. It used to be a government facility, high fences, armed guards, food supplies. I don't know if it's still intact, but it's our best shot." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You think that place is still standing? After all this time?" "It's worth a try," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "We can't afford to wait any longer. We need to take a chance." The others gathered around, listening intently. Despite the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, there was a spark of hope, however faint, in Sarah's words. They knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. If they stayed on this roof, they would eventually be overrun. They had to move forward. "All right," Mark said after a moment, nodding in agreement. "Let's do it." The group quickly packed up what little they had left. Supplies were low, but they couldn't afford to carry too much. Every ounce of weight on their backs was a burden, but they knew they had to make it count. Sarah was the first to lead the way, descending the fire escape carefully and ensuring the others followed closely behind. They moved quietly through the streets, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The sounds of the undead were all around them, but they had learned to be silent in the chaos. Every footstep was calculated, every breath controlled. They couldn't afford to make a sound. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Sarah could feel the tension building. They were getting closer to their destination, but they had no idea what they would find when they arrived. The government facility might be a ghost town, overrun by zombies or worse. But there was no turning back now. They reached the outskirts just as the sun began to rise, casting an eerie glow over the ruined landscape. The group paused, taking a moment to survey the area. The facility loomed in the distance, its high fences and watchtowers barely visible through the haze. But Sarah could see the telltale signs of life, movement near the gates, figures walking along the perimeter. "Looks like there's someone there," Mark said quietly, his eyes narrowed. "We're not alone." "Keep your heads down," Sarah ordered. "We don't know who those people are, and we can't afford to take chances." The group moved cautiously toward the facility, staying low and using the cover of abandoned buildings to conceal their movements. As they drew closer, they could see more clearly. The facility was still standing, but it was far from the secure stronghold Sarah had imagined. The fences were damaged in several places, and there were no signs of guards or patrols. "Doesn't look like a government compound," Mark muttered, his brow furrowed. "Maybe it's been overrun." "We'll find out soon enough," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with caution. "Stay close." They approached the gate, and Sarah cautiously examined the surrounding area. It looked deserted, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. She motioned for the others to wait while she moved toward the gate to investigate further. As she reached the fence, she noticed a small gap where the wire had been cut, just big enough to slip through. "This way," Sarah whispered, leading the group through the gap. They slipped into the compound quietly, their footsteps muffled against the gravel. The interior of the compound was eerily silent. Broken windows, rusted equipment, and abandoned vehicles scattered the area, but there was no sign of life. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they moved deeper into the facility, each corner they turned filled with uncertainty. It was too quiet, too empty. "Where is everyone?" Ethan asked softly, his voice tinged with fear. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "But we're not leaving without answers." They continued forward, navigating through the abandoned buildings, each room as empty as the last. There was no sign of human life, but the presence of fresh food and supplies suggested someone had been here recently. Then, they heard it. A low, guttural growl in the distance, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of undead feet. The silence was shattered in an instant as a group of zombies appeared at the far end of the hall, their eyes locked on the survivors. "We're not alone," Sarah whispered, her pulse racing once more. The fight was far from over. The sound of the zombies' shuffling feet echoed through the abandoned facility, growing louder with every passing second. The survivors froze, their hearts racing as they realized they had stumbled into a new kind of danger. The undead were close, too close, and they had no way to escape without a fight. Sarah's mind raced. They had no room to maneuver, no clear path to retreat. The only option was to face the threat head-on. She motioned for the others to stay still and stay quiet, her eyes scanning the room for anything they could use to their advantage. Mark was already at her side, his rifle aimed and ready, though he looked as worried as she felt. "We don't have enough ammo for a prolonged fight," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We need to make this quick." The group of zombies was slowly advancing, their decayed bodies lurching forward with unnerving determination. There were at least half a dozen of them, but Sarah knew that number could increase in a matter of moments. They had to act fast. "Ready?" Sarah whispered to the group, her eyes meeting each person's gaze. There was no time for second guesses. They needed to stick together if they wanted to survive. The survivors nodded in unison, weapons in hand, prepared to fight for their lives. Sarah moved first, darting toward a pile of rusted equipment near the wall. She grabbed a metal rod, using its weight to her advantage as she swung it at the nearest zombie. The blow connected with the creature's skull with a sickening crack, sending it sprawling to the floor. The group was quickly on the move, attacking the zombies one by one, each survivor doing their best to incapacitate their enemy. Mark fired his rifle, taking out another zombie with a single shot, but the noise of the gun was like a beacon in the stillness of the facility. Almost immediately, the remaining zombies turned their attention to the survivors, their grotesque forms lurching forward with frightening speed. "Stay close!" Sarah shouted, her voice commanding. "We need to move." The group fought back as best as they could, but the zombies kept coming. With every swing, with every shot, they were slowly being pushed back. The survivors' energy was waning, their movements becoming slower, more deliberate. They couldn't afford to keep fighting like this for much longer. Ethan, who had been fighting valiantly at Sarah's side, stumbled back as a zombie lunged at him. His knife slashed across its arm, but the creature was relentless. Before Ethan could react, the zombie was upon him, pushing him to the ground. He struggled beneath the creature's weight, his hands pushing against its decaying body in a desperate attempt to break free. "No!" Sarah shouted, her heart leaping into her throat as she turned to see her brother's plight. Without thinking, she bolted toward him, swinging her rod with all her might. The blow landed with a sickening thud, knocking the zombie off of Ethan. Sarah grabbed her brother's arm and hauled him to his feet, her breath ragged with the exertion. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency as she scanned him for injuries. "I'm fine," Ethan panted, though his face was pale, fear evident in his eyes. "Thanks." They didn't have time for more words. The zombies were still coming, and the survivors needed to regroup. Sarah's eyes darted around the facility, searching for any way out. The only option left was to fight their way through to the far exit, where a small courtyard offered a chance for them to escape. "We push forward," Sarah ordered, rallying the group. "We can't stay here." They charged forward, weapons raised, each one of them fighting for their lives as they moved toward the exit. Mark fired a few more shots, clearing the path as best as he could. The zombies weren't far behind, their numbers steadily increasing. The survivors pushed harder, adrenaline surging through their veins, urging them to move faster, to stay ahead of the growing horde. As they reached the exit, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The doors were locked. They had no way out. "Damn it!" Sarah cursed, slamming her fist against the door in frustration. She looked around quickly, her mind racing for another option. There was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to be trapped in this facility with the undead closing in. "Up there!" Mark shouted, pointing to a small maintenance ladder attached to the side of a nearby wall. It led up to a small window on the second floor, barely big enough for them to crawl through, but it was their only chance. Without hesitation, Sarah ran toward the ladder, motioning for the others to follow. She climbed up first, pulling herself through the narrow window with the others quickly behind her. The moment they were all inside, they slammed the window shut, locking it as best as they could. The group collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, their bodies drenched in sweat. "We made it," Mark said, his voice shaky with relief. "But we can't stay here long. Those zombies won't stop." Sarah nodded, her mind already turning. They were safe, for now. But this was just another temporary escape. The world outside was still overrun by the undead, and the fight for survival wasn't over. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward if they were going to find a real place to call home again. The survivors gathered themselves, taking a moment to catch their breath before Sarah spoke. "We need to find a real safe zone," she said, her voice filled with determination. "This place is just another temporary stop. The real fight is ahead of us, and we're not giving up. We're not going to let the zombies win." Her words echoed in the room as the survivors exchanged glances. They were exhausted, scared, and battered, but Sarah's resolve gave them hope. They had survived yet another close call, but the war was far from over. There was still a chance, a slim hope that they could find a way to reclaim their world, to rebuild what had been lost. The journey ahead would be long and treacherous. But together, they could survive. They had no choice.